Any comedian use his show to do serious issues. That's not what I'm there for.
Hollywood loves to polish its legends, but behind the glitter and applause lies a truth America rarely confronts. Some of the biggest stars ever to sit across from Johnny Carson carried racial attitudes that could have blown up their careers if spoken today. Carson wasn't just a talk show host, he was the silent gatekeeper between old Hollywood's prejudiced past and a changing nation that was finally beginning to demand better. And on The Tonight Show stage, the mask slipped more than once. Viewers saw charm, jokes, and nostalgia. Carson saw something else: the cracks. The moments when a casual comment revealed a worldview frozen in another century. He had to smile, steer, and smooth over what millions of Americans weren't yet ready to admit. Because the truth is, some guests didn't just make Johnny uncomfortable, they made history uncomfortable. And the first name on that list might shock you. Don Rickles, the friend Carson couldn't control. Don Rickles wasn't just a guest, he was a live grenade. Carson willingly rolled across the table every time he booked him. Rickles strutted onto the Tonight Show stage with the swagger of a man who believed no line existed, no boundary mattered, and no audience would dare turn on him. His insult comedy was legendary, but beneath the laughter was something darker, a willingness to mine race, ethnicity, and identity for shock value. He called it equal opportunity comedy. But Carson saw the truth. Rickles' jokes didn't always punch up. Sometimes they punched straight down, and America was beginning to feel the sting. Carson adored Rickles personally, which made the situation even more volatile. Their chemistry was perfect, their timing electric, but Rickles' unpredictable swings into racial caricature forced Johnny into quiet crisis mode more than once. Carson would smile, grit his teeth, then pivot like a man re-steering a ship away from a reef he'd spotted seconds before impact. Behind the scenes, staff recalled Carson issuing rare commands. If he says that word again, we cut. For Johnny, that was practically a shout. Rickles lived in a comedic universe all his own, but Carson had to protect the stage and America's living rooms from the jokes that belonged to a world already fading. And yet, Rickles wasn't the only legend whose old-era mindsets caused Johnny to tighten his grip on the wheel. Charlton Heston, the epic hero with volcanic opinions. Charlton Heston didn't walk onto Carson's stage. He descended like a man used to parting seas. His booming voice, towering presence, and cinematic gravitas made him appear carved from Mount Rushmore itself. But by the time Heston became a Tonight Show regular, he had rewritten his public identity from biblical hero to political warrior. And with that transformation came comments about race that made both Hollywood insiders and Tonight Show staff visibly tense. Heston increasingly framed systemic racism as exaggerated or outdated, dismissing civil rights concerns as relics of a bygone era. Carson knew this was dangerous territory. The audience expected warmth and nostalgia from Heston, not ideological grenades. So Johnny became tactical. Writers were instructed, almost surgically, to keep Heston talking about film sets, stunts, behind-the-scenes mishaps, anything but politics. But Heston wasn't easily contained. Off-camera, he sometimes let slip comments about activists or minority communities that made staff exchange uncomfortable glances. Carson heard enough to know where not to steer the ship. Yet, he also maintained his signature professionalism, crafting conversations that honored Heston's cinematic legacy without amplifying the views America was beginning to question. Heston embodied the contradiction of old Hollywood, a hero carved in marble, cast in roles of righteousness, yet deeply dismissive of the struggles unfolding outside the studio gates. And Carson, ever the diplomat, had to navigate the gulf between Heston's on-screen nobility and his off-screen absolutes. Red Skelton, the beloved icon who refused to evolve. Red Skelton was comedy royalty, one of the last living bridges to vaudeville, radio, and the earliest days of television. When he appeared on The Tonight Show, Johnny treated him with reverence. This was a man who shaped American entertainment long before Carson ever dreamed of sitting behind a desk. But Skelton carried with him the full weight, and the full blindness of his era. Unlike other stars who quietly distanced themselves from racially insensitive material as times changed, Skelton insisted the world was wrong, not him. He defended minstrel humor, blackface traditions, and racial caricatures well into the 1,980 seconds. On air, he occasionally complained that networks had become too sensitive or that audiences couldn't take a joke anymore. Carson never confronted him, but he didn't encourage him either. When Skelton drifted toward the old jokes, Johnny's reaction became a masterclass in subtle crisis management. A polite nod, a quick pivot, a new question fired like a lifeline. The audience reactions told the real story. Laughter that once came freely now arrived strained, uneasy, or not at all. America was evolving rapidly, and Skelton wasn't. For Carson, it was bittersweet, honoring a pioneer while protecting his audience from a comedic worldview frozen in another century. And the gap widened every time. Skelton refused to acknowledge why those jokes no longer landed. Burt Reynolds, the golden boy with a shadow. Burt Reynolds was the kind of guest producers loved, handsome, funny, self-aware, and unpredictable in all the right ways. His chemistry with Carson was undeniable. They teased each other, traded jabs, and created some of the most replayed moments in Tonight Show history. But Reynolds had blind spots, shaped by a childhood spent in the segregated South. Most of the time, Reynolds was charming and inclusive, but every so often, he drifted into racial territory that hit a nerve with viewers. The most infamous moment came during a 1978 appearance when he cracked a series of jokes about Native Americans. The audience laughed awkwardly. The mailroom did not. Hundreds of complaint letters poured into NBC. Carson, who rarely interfered with rerun decisions, did something uncharacteristically firm. He pulled that segment from circulation for years. Not because he wanted to shame Reynolds, the two were genuinely close, but because Johnny sensed America had reached a turning point. Some humor wasn't just outdated, it was harmful. Reynolds might not have meant malice, but intent didn't erase impact. And Carson knew this. He continued inviting Reynolds back, but monitored the tone more carefully, guiding him away from subjects where his old Southern instincts might surface again. It was a reminder that even the most likable stars sometimes carried remnants of the world that raised them, and sometimes it slipped out on national television. Buddy Hackett, the comedy relic who refused to update his map. Buddy Hackett was chaos wrapped in a comedian's suit. He was outrageous, fearless, and to Carson's occasional dismay frozen in comedic traditions, America was rapidly abandoning. Hackett didn't just dabble in outdated jokes. He celebrated them. He saw political correctness as the enemy and racial humor as his rightful battlefield. Where other comics adjusted with the times, Hackett doubled down. His routines, both on and off air, were filled with accents, stereotypes, and punchlines that belonged to a different century. Younger comedians whispered that Hackett was the last guy still telling World War II-era slurs. Carson walked a tightrope with him. He liked Hackett. America liked Hackett. But The Tonight Show had standards quiet, often invisible standards that evolved as the country did. When Hackett performed a particularly offensive bit in the mid-70 seconds, Carson took action no one expected. He banned the routine from ever airing again. Hackett wasn't punished. He wasn't exiled. But he was firmly, unmistakably, told where the line was. And he never forgot it. The challenge with Hackett wasn't that he was malicious, it was that he stubbornly refused to leave the comedic world he was born into. A world Carson had no choice but to move beyond. Bob Hope, the American sweetheart. With a darkly dated playbook, Bob Hope was America's comedian, the smiling, golf club-wielding entertainer who performed for troops, hosted specials, and seemed to embody national unity. But his early comedy was built on blackface routines, Asian caricatures, and racial stereotypes that aged poorly, even before Hope acknowledged the problem, which he never really did. Hope's Tonight Show appearances were a study in generational contrast. Johnny respected Hope immensely, but he also knew the man refused to evolve. When asked about his old racially charged routines, Hope deflected. He dismissed concerns as people being too sensitive. He claimed his jokes were harmless fun. But America was changing, and Carson could feel it in real time. When Hope veered toward those older patterns, mocking accents, dropping racially loaded punchlines, or referencing stereotypes, Carson tightened his smile. He laughed politely, then he redirected with surgical speed. Hope's case was complicated because his patriotism made him untouchable for decades. His USO tours earned him eternal goodwill. But goodwill couldn't erase the racial undertones built into his comedy foundation. Carson walked the line, honoring the legend, while refusing to amplify the humor that no longer reflected the world outside the studio. And sometimes, even Johnny's charm couldn't smooth out Hope's roughest edges. John Wayne, the icon who cast the longest shadow. John Wayne wasn't just a movie star, he was American mythology incarnate. For millions, he symbolized strength, honor, and masculinity. But Wayne also carried the most publicly documented racial views of any Carson guest views that erupted into national controversy after his notorious 1971 Playboy interview. Wayne didn't hide behind coded language. He openly endorsed white supremacy. He dismissed systemic racism. He justified the seizure of Native American lands. And unlike others who later apologized, Wayne stood by his words. Carson felt the impact immediately. Before the interview, their interactions were warm, relaxed, friendly. Afterward, the temperature shifted. Carson never confronted Wayne on air. That wasn't Johnny's style, but the emotional distance was unmistakable. The easy banter was gone. In its place was a formal, tense politeness. Wayne never said anything explicitly racist on The Tonight Show, but his public statements echoed across the studio every time he sat down. Carson was forced to navigate a cultural landmine. How do you honor an icon the country worships while knowing the beliefs behind the curtain are far uglier than the man on horseback? Johnny's solution was subtle but powerful. He didn't challenge Wayne. He didn't validate him. He simply withheld the warmth. And sometimes silence speaks louder than argument. Hollywood projected perfection, but Johnny Carson knew better. Night after night, he sat across from legends whose private beliefs were far more volatile than their polished public personas. Carson never exposed them outright. Instead, he became the quiet navigator of an industry struggling to evolve. A slight smirk, a tightened jaw, a swift change of subject. These were his subtle moves to keep The Tonight Show from stumbling into racial controversy on live television. Don Rickles could turn a joke into racial shrapnel without warning. Charlton Heston carried the voice of an epic hero but opinions that clashed with a changing America. Bob Hope leaned on outdated stereotypes. Red Skelton defended minstrel traditions, and Burt Reynolds occasionally let traces of the Old South slip through. Carson wasn't perfect, but he understood the moment. Sometimes progress isn't loud. Sometimes it's one calm host guiding the culture forward while the world watches. If you love deep Hollywood revelations like this, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment. Your support helps bring more hidden stories, forgotten truths, and behind-the-scenes secrets back into the spotlight.